thank you all for coming out here at Texas State. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the Epoch of Space conference for inviting me, and also, of course, to apologize for not being there. I really wish I could be in Spain, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate, if only remotely. And I want to thank the people here at Texas State for coming out, and Matt Greengold in particular for arranging this recording. Okay. When Michel Foucault famously named ours the Epoch of Space, he was above all thinking of the shift away from 19th century historicisms with their powerful sense of the unfolding of events over time, and how that revealed the meaning of our lives, experiences, and perceptions. The spatial turn, as it has been called, is not so much a rejection of the temporal or historical in favor of the spatial or geographical, as it is a sort of rebalancing of the scales. Henceforth, as spatially oriented critics might assert, matters of space, place, and mapping, and so forth, may be given their due, and we must emphasize the degree to which all things are conditioned by a spatiotemporality, not just spatiality or temporality. If the emphasis has recently been placed on spatiality, that's in part because of the persistent feeling that temporality had previously been privileged, and hence space must be reckoned with more directly. Among the most significant features of the spatial turn in the humanities is the recognition that space must be seen as more than an empty container, a mere setting for characters and events to establish their more meaningful effects over time. To be sure, setting itself has always also been significant, but the sense was that spatial configurations were mostly seen as a backdrop, or the stage upon which the real story takes place. The renewed attention to the ways that space and spatial relations actively shape characters and events typifies the geocritical or spatial approach to literature. To a certain extent, I think writers have always been well attuned to this, in a way that critics or readers may not always have been. I've argued in the past that nearly all creative writing must be taken as a form of literary cartography, a sort of figurative map making by which the writer helps to give form to or make sense of the world. By engaging in such literary cartographic practice, the writer could be said to employ a poetics of the boundary, demarcating territories, establishing borders, drawing lines, making connections, projecting spaces beyond. The aesthetic program associated with this map making can involve any number of techniques, aims, effects, of course, but the delineation of spaces and places within the narrative, say, will not only establish the setting for other actions, but actively determine the actions, as well as the conditions for their possibility. In not only depicting the world, but also affirmatively shaping it, the literary cartographic project discloses its implicitly political project. The geocritical approach to literature, as I understand it, and I do use the term somewhat broadly, must take into account the real significance of space and place, really in the way that most writers already do, as I suggest. But in so doing, it must also recognize the political impetus and effects of this project. For the purposes of this talk, I'd like to focus more on these critical practices associated with literary studies, and leave the discussion of creative writers and their poetics to another time. Recently, I've become concerned about certain trends in literary criticism, and perhaps especially in the spatial humanities, which it seems to me have obscured, if not actively repressed, the political or ideological aspects of the critical project. I want to suggest that a spatially oriented approach to literature necessarily involves critique, and indeed a form of ideology critique, which of course means both acknowledging the ideological content and the context of the various texts under consideration, and of course affirming the value of critique itself. Critical practices in the humanities have often been connected to political values, movements, theories, some more overtly than others. Eco-criticism, for instance, with its close ties to the environmental movement and to green social policies, announces itself as a participant in real-world politics, taking sides and making a stand in significant matters of contemporary controversy. By contrast, geocriticism would appear to be somewhat neutral in its politics. Space does not appear to be a very effective slogan, and urging readers to pay more attention to matters of space, place, or mapping in literary and cultural studies hardly seems like a politically motivated program. And yet, many of the leading theorists and critics associated with the spatial turn in the humanities have emerged from the political left, from a tradition of oppositional criticism, if not actually Marxist or revolutionary critical theory. And I think that this is not entirely surprising. There's no coincidence, even if there are many different spatially oriented approaches to literature, culture, and society that do not align themselves with Marxist or otherwise radical politics. Contrary to first appearances, perhaps matters of space and spatial relations are intensely political, infused with ideology, and subject to extensive debate. Space, place, and mapping are fundamentally bound up with ideology, such that a geocritical approach may, among other things, may be a form of ideology critique. In a moment when so-called surface reading or post-critical approaches to literature have been increasingly championed by prominent scholars and critics in well-known journals and elsewhere, I think this sort of ideology critique is needed now more than ever, and that the spatially oriented critique made possible by geocriticism is particularly well suited to the crises and mystifications facing us in the 21st century. In this presentation, I want to touch on just a few issues arising from this observation. First, I thought it might be useful to examine a different approach, one that I find both fascinating and problematic, namely Franco Moretti's ambitious distant reading project, which arose in part from Moretti's interest in literary geography and spatial criticism. This much heralded project has recently come to a sort of close, at least from Moretti's own perspective, so we're now in an advantageous position to assess its strengths and weaknesses. From Moretti's own acknowledgement of the limits or failures of his project, I then will look at the ways that space and place necessarily involve political or ideological practices that in turn make it crucial for the critic to maintain a kind of hermeneutics of suspicion when analyzing them. Thus, I conclude with the need for critique, and in our Epoch of Space, a spatially oriented critical theory and practice seems all the more suited to the demands of the present moment. So, one of the key dichotomies I discuss in examining literary cartography involves the distinction between the itinerary and the map, which has been explored by such diverse theorists as Michel de Certeau, Frederick Jameson, and the linguists Charlotte Lind and William Leboff, among others. These itinerary and map figures yield two different visions of and experiences with space, which might be understood in the older philosophical idiom as subjective and objective, but which are inextricably intertwined in practice. That is to say, the subject's perspective in moving about space on the street level, say, is informed by the speculative overview of a map-like representation, a bird's eye view that enables the provisional sense of spatial totality while also allowing one to navigate space along discrete mobile trajectories. Or to put it more simply, as we walk along, we project a mental overview or map, which in turn helps us to make possible alternative itineraries. In an evocative play on such practices, Franco Moretti's project of distant reading, it seems to me, attempted to engage this distinction at the level of literary history, with unexpected results. One of the more provocative literary programs to emerge in the last 20 years or so, Franco Moretti's controversial approach to world literature, labeled distant reading, attempted to redefine literary history according to a grand mapping or panoptic overview, moving readers farther and farther away from the street level, as I called it, of literature. Those who know Moretti's work will already be aware of how much space and spatial practices inform his thinking. And his distant reading project grew out of a large mapping project to which he had been devoted for years. This project demonstrates some of the excitement as well as the problems with that form of spatial criticism. In a 2017 issue of PMLA, the Publications of the Modern Language Association, contained a special section devoted to distant reading, here referring to the 2013 book published by Moretti, which included many of his essays associated with this project over the years. But also this mini symposium had to do with the method itself and the project in general, and not just the book of essays called Distant Reading. Moretti had announced this project in a 2000 essay called Conjectures on World Literature, which is reprinted as the first chapter of that book, Distant Reading. The section in PMLA included a number of interesting essays on the book and on the project, but I'd like to focus for the purposes of this talk on Moretti's own brief response, in which Moretti offers an interesting analogy drawn from Goethe to explain his preference for viewing things at a distance. I'm quoting Moretti here. When you arrive in a new town, writes Goethe in his Italian journey, you should first of all climb up to the top of the bell tower to get a sense of the city as a whole. Someone else could have said, go straight to the cathedral and see what's inside. They are both good ideas, and it all depends on what you're interested in. This is Moretti talking, I'm more interested in designs and layout than in brushstrokes and cathedrals, whence distant reading, end quote. Then Moretti goes on to say, quote, it's not just a matter of liking it better, it's that I understand it better if I'm far away. Although he concedes that both design and details may be equally important depending on what the scholar is interested in studying. I'm sympathetic to Moretti's position, and I've myself argued in favor of critical distance as a means of gaining clear understanding of a given phenomenon. After all, the figure of the map is itself, in a sense, a means by which to gain a clarifying overview through a distant perspective. However, I've also been suspicious of what sometimes seems like a cult of big data. Moretti, with his method of distant reading, represents one of the most respected literary theorists engaging with this cult. This has, I think, led not only to a movement away from close reading, obviously, but away from literature in general. And I believe the effect, perhaps even the aim, is detrimental to the literary humanities as a whole. It has also had the effect of derailing what I think was a more effective train of thought within spatial literary studies while hopping aboard a trolley bound for a cul-de-sac, as Moretti's own retrospective comments suggest. More on that in a moment. Moretti's idea for distant reading is laid out in that essay from 2000, Conjectures on World Literature, in which he introduces this project as a way to get at things you couldn't otherwise get through close reading. He says, in order to grasp the field, quote, literary history will quickly become very different from what it is now. It will become secondhand, a patchwork of other people's research, without a single direct textual reading. He underlines that last bit. End quote. Rather than reading individual texts, the distant reader will examine other units, quote, much smaller or much larger than the text, devices, themes, tropes, or genres, or systems. Distant reading, therefore, is not a supplementary approach to close reading, but a new kind of reading entirely. In order to achieve this, the old tools of criticism are no longer of much use. This is also a spatialization of the field of literary history, such that it can be surveyed more broadly and effectively, at least from Moretti's point of view. The experiment would appear to involve ways of perceiving literature without actually reading the text. In his 2005 book, Graph Maps Trees, Moretti provides what he calls abstract models, graphs, maps, and trees, for such an approach. Using quantitative research from various sources, graphs can be made that will offer a distant reader a bird's eye view of the rise and fall of various genres. By plotting elements of a text on a diagram, maps may provide a new look at the way literary spaces are represented and experienced. And by graphically showing the dead ends and the continuing lines of literary convention, trees provide a model for the evolution of literary forms. Each model allows the distant reader to examine different facets of the literary field, and each involves a form of explanation that minimizes the process of interpretation. As Moretti points out, the models, quote, share a clear preference for explanation over interpretation, or perhaps better, for explanation of general structures over the interpretation of individual texts, end quote. Here, what is interpreted are data, not texts. Unstated in Moretti's account is the degree to which collecting such data itself requires a form of reading, not unlike another kind of mapping, which depends upon conventions, principles of selection, and identifies particular details over others, and so on and so on. In a New York Times piece published in October 30th, 2017, around the same time the PMLA symposium came out, Moretti concedes that his aspirations in dabbling with these dark arts were not realized, but he remains largely unapologetic. Quote, I'd rather be a failed revolutionary than someone who never tried to do a revolution in the first place. However, Moretti also identified an area in which his own work has suffered, since he allowed himself to engage in computational criticism, as he refers to it in that article. He admits that his work has suffered from a lack of theory, and in an understated aside admits, quote, and to be frank, I think it's true of the digital humanities as a whole. A certain glibness takes over in these practices, Moretti admits, and knowledge itself is the victim. Quote, time after time I felt myself and others slip into micro-explanations, ad hoc, often improvised reactions to the pressure of this or that finding, which I couldn't connect with any broader horizon. Knowledge seemed to shrink into half-knowledge, a false modesty bordering on intellectual hide-and-seek, or the coarse anti-intellectualism exemplified by Wired magazine's proclamation that correlation is enough and that the scientific method is obsolete. He's there quoting an article from Wired magazine. End quote. The generalized antipathy towards critical theory, or theory in general, so prevalent in recent years, has found both allies and champions among the enthusiasts of post-critical reading, as may be seen in the form of Rita Felsky's celebrated work on the uses of literature and the limits of critique, for example. Moretti's project, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not, contributed to this anti-critical and anti-theoretical tendency in contemporary literary studies. In fairness, Moretti's own claims for this work have been somewhat more reserved, and he's not allowed himself to become so besotted with big data that he has turned his back on theory. As he has admitted, quote, the fact is, big data has produced a decline in theoretical interest, which in its turn has made our results often mediocre. More data is not the solution here. We have enough data already. Only a resolute return to theory may change the way we work, end quote. I agree, and I want to argue that this resolute return to theory is precisely what is needed for any meaningful approach to world literature as well. It may be that the desirable critical distance afforded by a return to theorizing can take advantage of the resources made available by computers and databases without succumbing to the Silicon Valley's mania for tech-enabled disruption. It may also be that we don't need the computers and big data at all to do some of this work. Moretti's analogy, taken from Goethe, offers other possibilities. Climbing to the top of the tallest building and looking around versus going straight to the town's cathedral and inspecting the interior, these do not simply approximate methods of distant versus close reading. They represent two approaches, or two ways of approaching the territory to be mapped. Moretti in that same section also mentions Northrop Frye, who had differentiated between the close-up view of brushstrokes in a painting versus the more distant perspective that discloses designs. And Moretti finds both worthy, although, again, he says he prefers design and layout to the details of brushstrokes. Moretti's metaphor is telling. He calls for something like an aesthetic of distance, a perspective from far away and above, a bird's eye view, as I keep calling it, or in a more idealistic model, a God's eye view that could somehow take in everything at once and allow us to see shapes, patterns, and interconnections that would be hard to discern from a more pedestrian vantage. Again, I'm sympathetic to this idea, for it is very much like a kind of cognitive mapping, whereby one attempts to create a sense of place for oneself in an otherwise unrepresentable system. And yet, to speak plainly, the map really isn't the territory, and it seems to me that some of the enthusiasts of a program of distant reading have mistaken the data itself, or maybe even the mere data collection itself, for the work to be done. An aesthetic of distance holds merit as an attempt to cognitively map the unmappable, yet it also risks the dangers of a bloodless abstraction and the inhuman techno-utopianism. Moretti's calls for a return to theory as a sign of his remorse, perhaps. In any event, the approach to world literature that would use models of distant reading ought to also be supported by theoretical practices that can help us make sense of this work. The overview from the bell tower and the detailed view inside the cathedral each provide valuable information about the town, to continue employing this Moretti's Italian metaphor. But Italian journey metaphor, I should say. But neither is definitive. One doesn't know the town better, whatever that would mean, using one method or the other. The artist in practice tends to engage both registers, paying careful attention to both individual brushstrokes and more expansive designs. And I would say that's the case in literary art as well. In literature, the texts operate along the boundaries of these perspectives, combining the empirical experience of personal experiences with broader social, cultural, historical themes and concepts. Spatial literary studies likely needs to keep these in mind as well, making punctual interventions into the vast literary history and geography of world literature, while also attempting to maintain some sort of big picture, even if that picture is constantly modified and updated. This imaginary space between the subject's perception and the global totality, this boundary between close and distant reading, offers a promising site for criticism and theory today. Moving from the methods of literary criticism or literary history back out into the broader social sphere, we can see how these alternative but interrelated frames of reference shape not only our perception of social space, but the spaces themselves. Moving to a new section. When Foucault sought to illustrate the operations and effects of power as a means of discipline and control in modern societies, he famously used an architectural model, Jeremy Bentham's proposed prison design for the Panopticon. It's a memorable figure, and as we may envision, the captive bodies are distributed within a fixed, carefully regulated space, bodies subject to constant automatic surveillance. However, the chapter begins, memorably, not with a description of the prison structure, but with another analogy, namely the way in which late 17th century authorities responded to a health crisis, in this case, the outbreak of a plague in their cities. Quote, first, a strict spatial partitioning. Inspection functions ceaselessly. Surveillance is based on a system of permanent registration. This is several lines from Foucault, skipping lines in between points that he's making at the beginning of the Panopticism chapter. The organization of space and the localization, surveillance, and registration of of individuals and groups within the spatial array are essential to the formation of the society as a whole in Foucault's reckoning. As an unidentified voice tells us, you are here, we are watching you, and we know who you are, where you're from, what you're up to, ultimately, where you do and do not belong. Unsurprisingly, Foucault's vision thus resembles, as so many people noted when he first came out with it, resembles Orwell's. Nor is it surprising that Orwell seems so timely today, in a moment when these discussions of borders and walls dominate the headlines. The establishment of a de facto or de jure border is, in some senses, an essential aspect of power and its functioning. The lines are almost always imaginary, like parallels and meridians on the globe, but their effects are all too real. Even informal or casual borderlines, such as those separating so-called good from bad neighborhoods, for example, often function as rigid boundaries, which for some might as well be impenetrable as walls, while for others they demarcate zones of contact or passage. Of all the real and imaginary lines that appear in our physical and mental maps, the lines that we cross, the lines that we dare not cross, surely none is so salient as the national border, a fact that forms itself into being over a very long history of various collective fantasies. If a nation is an imagined community, after all, as Benedict Anderson so famously characterized it, then its borders are merely abstract, artificial, utterly contingent. Just how contingent, indeed, history itself reveals as we see the lines redrawn, erased, and drawn again all the time. Nationalism has never really respected borders, of course, for its ideological power rests in identifying nations both within and beyond a given national space's figured limits on the map. The national border is thus a powerful symbol and a symbol of power, symbolic, yes, but with all too real effects and consequences. For all the talk of a global community or of a borderless world, one need only be stopped at the border by customs officials, the police, the military, homeland security. We think of the ideological resonances of that term, and so forth, to know just how effective and resilient those supposedly blurred lines between countries remain. Yet it is also the case that with increased mobility and sometimes unavoidable displacement, these national borders must be transgressed. Global economy demands it, and this is essential to the very world market that is the foundation of all economic and political relations today, much to the chagrin of the reactionaries, as Marx and Engels famously put it in 1848. Indeed, the very raison d'etre of the border involves not merely the separation but the connection, for a line that marks different sides is also a line to be crossed. Transgressivity is a fundamental feature of this space. In Latin, and I don't presume to tell some of the people here are Latin, with my 4 years of high school Latin now a good 30-some years behind me, but I'll try it out anyhow. In Latin, the idea was indicated by the term limes, plural limitus, which could be used to designate any number of limits, but which also stood for a frontier or boundary of the Roman Empire itself. The limes represents an end, an outer boundary, a mark of enclosure. However, what we tend to think of as liminality is far from the closed space of a delimited territory, but itself an in-between space of potentiality. In a ruse of etymology, one of those philological phantasms that trick the mind with false solemnitude or homophony, the limes does not necessarily share a root with the lemen, the latter designating a threshold. To be sure, a boundary and a border might become a threshold, but only when it is transgressed. The lemen suggests a space more explicitly understood as a site of transgressivity, a point of entry into another zone. Unlike the closed space or place given form by its perceived limits, limitus, the liminal space or site of the lemen is one of opening, unfolding, and becoming. Indeed, one could say that the political program of liminality, if there were such a thing, would have to involve the transformation of the limes into a limen, the boundary becoming the threshold. And as we reflect on restrictive or limiting power of borders, we do well to recall and to acknowledge and to embrace the potential joy that comes with overcoming them. Indeed, to return to the Foucault and his theory of power, the forces shaping the social spaces and ourselves are themselves subject to constant resistance, reversal, redirection. To apprehend the limits as mere walls is to fail to see what lies beyond, along with what they are made of and what they represent. This is why I've been insisting that spatial literary studies, or geocriticism, if you like, as a fundamental critical practice or set of practices, is a form of critique. I thus oppose the seemingly fashionable post-critical approach and emphasize the persistence of critical theory, even in my view, sort of old-fashioned critical theory, and it gets more old-fashioned every day, I guess. Indeed, to use an older expression, redolent of the Marxisms of yore, there is a fundamental element of ideology critique in the geocritical program, which takes space, place, mapping, and other spatial relations as concepts, phenomena, and practices wholly bound up in the mystifications, but also the potential demystifications of modern social existence. For example, or rather, I wanted to cite a memorable passage from The Political Unconscious, where Frederick Jameson observes that, quote, interpretation always presupposes, if not a conception of the unconscious itself, then at least some mechanism of mystification or repression, in terms of which it would make sense to seek a latent meaning behind the manifesto. Jameson acknowledges, quote, the objection of the ordinary reader when confronted with elaborate or ingenious interpretations that the text means just what it says. But adds, this is Jameson again, quote, unfortunately, no society has ever been quite so mystified in quite so many ways as our own, saturated as it is with messages and information, the very vehicles of mystification. If everything were transparent, then no ideology would be possible, and no domination either. Evidently, that is not our case. End quote. Not surprisingly, Jameson's sense of narrative as a socially symbolic act is connected to a project of something like ideology critique. In recent years, this sort of approach to narrative and call to social criticism has come under fire. Ideology critique is not only old-fashioned, it seems, but objectionable in its very worldview, operating as it does through a, quote, hermeneutics of suspicion that ever seeks to uncover hidden and sometimes intentionally hidden meanings. And yet it seems awfully bad timing to me to abandon critique. If Jameson in 1981 was thinking of a society of the spectacle of consumer capitalism, of what he was just beginning then to refer to as postmodernism, how much more suspicious ought we to be in our time of the internet's World Wide Web and of fake news and social media scandals and complex yet stark ideological divides? It is perhaps a sign of how thoroughly the hermeneutics of suspicion has pervaded my spirit that I become instantly skeptical when told that things are just so and that there's nothing to see here and that you shouldn't ask so many questions. Much as we may disdain the unnecessarily complicated, the overly simplified seems to me far more dangerous. Even more than the deliberate attempts to mislead with fake news or bald-faced lies that permeate public discourse in the United States today and elsewhere, and at other times, the honest belief held by many that there's little beyond ordinary appearance of things is pernicious. If anything, the boundless mystifications of our era call for more hermeneutics and more suspicion, such that the appeals to the plain, the simple, and the ordinary can't help but serve the forces of mystification and hence the status quo, if only as an unintended consequence. Interpretation in spatial literary studies, or more broadly, certainly should not stop at trying to find the single discrete truth with a capital T, a holy grail unworthy of the quest if it even existed, But a robust critical hermeneutic is needed to make sense of the present, which is a prerequisite of any meaningful change. The results, in my view, are not only truer in that ironic Nietzschean sense, but also more interesting. And by way of conclusion, I'd merely add that the achievement of a sense of place in a rapidly changing, vicissitudinous social, spatial, and spatiotemporal ensemble is not to be taken for granted, and it is itself perhaps a worthy goal. This was the pedagogical and the political impetus behind Jameson's conception of cognitive mapping. And the practice of cognitive mapping, or whatever else we may want to call it, is ongoing as the ways we try to make sense of the world, like the world itself, are constantly changing. But this is also why doing so can be so rewarding, a fact rarely acknowledged by the enemies of critique who, intentionally or not, cannot be other than, as I say, defenders, in a way, of the status quo. For all the Black Forest gloom and prison house austerity that the post-critical and anti-theoretical critics perceive in the writings, say, of an Adorno or a Foucault, or those who still read them, there is also that unrecognized joy that comes with critique. As Jameson wrote in 2008 in the preface to the new edition of Ideologies of Theory, quote, "Inasmuch as ideological analysis is so frequently associated with the querulous and irritable negativism, it may be appropriate to stress the interest and delight all these topics, dilemmas, and contradictions, as well as jests and positions, still have for me." End quote. Often forgotten amid the somber lessons of history, the incisive critiques of the present, and the tenebrous forecasts of what seems likely to come, is the sheer pleasure of engaging in critical theory. And perhaps this is the worst sin of those who wish to promote an anti-theory or post-critical approach to literature. They're trying to spoil all our fun. Thank you.